Blog Talk Radio.
Good evening, everyone. This is Stephen Lewis with my colleague and friend Stephen Frampton, here with you to discuss all sorts of current event topics, and in particular the mysterious and provocative downing of Malaysian Flight 17. But first, before we get started, let me greet my colleague Steve Frampton. How are you doing this evening, sir?
I'm doing really well, thank you, Stephen. Just upset about all of these flights that have gone down. It's just unbelievable that there have been so many tragedies in the last couple of weeks.
Yes.
Really shocking.
Tragedy would be, sort of an understatement, especially when we think about the history of Malaysian aviation in recent months here. We had the other Malaysian flight go down, sort of just disappear, not too long ago. That got everyone riled up, and there were actually passengers who sort of remarked on the irony of, wow, what if something like that happened to us? How ironic would that be? What are the probabilities of something like that happening? And then boom, lo and behold, hey, it did happen. But the big question on everyone's mind is, who is responsible for it? And was it an accidental downing of the plane, or was it not?
Yes, I mean, it seems pretty clear that it was the media suggests that it's very clear that the rebels in eastern Ukraine shot it down with a missile system that originated in Russia. But then there are some very strange reports. So the Pentagon and the White House confirmed that they have evidence. They're saying now that they have evidence that the Russians are actually firing targets in eastern Ukraine from Russian territory just across the border, because they have this huge military build-up. But there's obviously a lot of debate about whether, or the extent to which, Russia was involved in the downing of the plane, or at least the supply of equipment to the rebels that shot down the plane, apparently. But then, very strangely, I watched a long press release, a media release in Moscow, and they were explaining that the Russians were saying that they have evidence that this plane was being followed by two Ukrainian military aircraft. So it really is the most bizarre situation, right, in which there's so much conjecture and speculation and blaming with evidence that isn't in the public domain. It's quite strange. So I think, Stephen, it will be really interesting to explore the charts for MH17, but then also to consider that chart in the context of Russia's chart and potentially other charts as well.
Excellent. Let's definitely do that. Russia is going to have an interesting 24 months, to say the very least, and probably extending beyond that. I tell you, I have to admit, I'm confused as to the ultimate culpability of why the plane came down. Reports that coming out of Russia and other sources show the Ukrainians as being quite brutish in their attacks, and of course there are opposite reports as well. So it's a situation of he said, she said, who's right, who's wrong. I have a chart here cast. Perhaps we can compare some of the salient features of these charts to make sure we're on the right track. I might need to make some adjustments here. But I believe the pertinent date for the crash is July 17th, 2014, correct, Steve?
That's what I have, yes. And it took off from Schiphol Airport in Amsterdam en route to Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. So it took off at 12:31 p.m.
Oh, I didn't know
local time. Yeah, I've just emailed you the chart, actually, Stephen. I know you had a problem with your software, so I've sent you the chart for MH17, and it's probably worth us telling our listeners that when we're analysing travel safety or airline safety, then we would look at the chart for the time of the plane is due to take off or took off.
Absolutely right. That's a critical moment. It sort of encapsulates or takes a snapshot of the flight as a whole. And I did get the chart that you sent me, Steve. Let me pull that up now. and see what we have here. Actually, you were kind enough to send me two charts. One is a graphic of tables, and I tell you, when you're when you're a nerdy guy like me, when you see a bunch of tables and charts, you just get really happy. So
yes, yeah, or a bunch of a bunch of good books being delivered by Amazon or whoever else.
Oh man,
that's Christmas time.
That smile on the box is just the absolute best, isn't it?
Yeah.
Well,
but, the thing that struck me first of all about this chart, Stephen, is that we've talked in the past about the lunar nodes, that axis, and when we look at this chart, we can see straight away that at the time of takeoff, the sun was squaring the lunar nodes, in other words, in the bends. That's a bad sign to begin with. I certainly wouldn't be getting on a flight that when the sun was in the bends, because we know that anything that is in the bends, particularly at a very close 90-degree angle, which is the case in this chart, that we know that's a sign of trouble, that the very essence of the initiative or the project or the entity is very much diminished by that particular formation in a chart. So that was my first observation, and that's what made me think, well, hold on, I would not get on the flight if the sun was in the bends.
Yeah, I wouldn't either, and especially in a configuration where the bends in this case is conjunct Mars in the first house. Man, we have the North Node at 23 degrees Libra. We have Mars at 25 degrees Libra. This conjunction is quite bad for us. It's good for Mars because the North Node is going to increase Mars's power. But we're talking about Mars here. That's not good. So normally we have a bit of metaphysical algebra at play here. The North Node is positive, but Mars is sort of a big negative in terms of effect. So a negative and a positive make a negative, don't they? Now, if Mars were conjunct the South Node, the decreasing, lessening effect of the South Node would have reduced Mars's evil, maleficence. It would have reduced that, and what we would have algebraically is two negatives equal a positive, because the South Node is negative, Mars is negative. Their combination somehow, in the algebra of esotericism, it results in a positive event. But, we don't have that here. We have Mars conjunct the North Node. And all of this squared to the Sun, which is itself conjunct Jupiter in the 10th house.
I think this issue with the North Node is absolutely fascinating, Stephen, because I always describe the North Node of the Moon and the South Node to the Moon to my clients in this way. So I say, the South Node is really a power outage. Energy is sucked out of the chart or the entity when the South Node is triggered, and the North Node is a power surge. So you've got an excess of energy potentially at the North Node. So think of it as though I think, well, the North Node is like the mouth. It's where we draw energy in to the entity, and therefore the South Node is the anus. We excrete or let go of energy at that point in the chart. And here, obviously, we've got Mars very closely conjunct the North Node, so that's energy coming in, and Mars, we know, represents accidents, but more specifically in this case, in all cases, it can represent a missile. So you've got incoming energy potentially associated with a missile in the case of this chart, and that Mars again squaring the Sun, the very mission. So it indicated that at a minimum that this would be a flight, or could well be a flight, that would be subject to an accident or even a missile. Mars, and obviously, this flight was taken down not because it lost its power, but because it was struck by a huge oncoming force or influx of energy, which I think is described by that Mars at the North Node. That's a missile coming at you.
Without doubt. Let's all take note, Mars is in an air sign in this chart.
Yes, good, well spotted.
Yeah, and besides that, Mars in Libra traditionally represents impotent or bungling generals. So this really screams, "Hey, this is a mistake." Because if you observe where, as you put it rather brilliantly and metaphorically, if you notice where the anus of this axis is located, it's in the seventh house. The people who brought the plane down. The seventh house is in opposition to the ascendant. The first house is Libra. 5 degrees of Libra rises. And with the North Node and Mars in the first house, this puts that intake of energy on the actual body of the plane. So Venus rules Libra. So the fuselage of the plane, the actual body of the plane, is shown by Venus in Gemini, ruled by a rather difficult Mercury in Cancer conjunct the midheaven. Okay, the passengers are shown, unfortunately, by the moon in Aries. As far as I'm concerned, I'm going off the basis of the moon representing the commoners, the common people here, and moon in Aries conjunct the descendant, conjunct the enemies, so to speak, the firer of the rocket launcher or whatever, the missile system. This is just bad in the symbolism of the chart. When you have the symbol for Team A in the territory of Team B, this is bad for Team A, roughly speaking. Also note the South Node very close to Uranus in the 7th house in Aries. To me, this really screams, this configuration is screaming brash trigger man, as far as I'm concerned. So let's see if we have Venus in trine to Mars, and Venus is the fuselage of the plane, the body of the plane represented by Venus being the the first house ruler in Libra. So, it doesn't bode well. What's interesting for me, though, are the consequences of the accident. I don't want to call it an accident. It wasn't an accident. It was an act of murder. Is what it was.
Well, there's the question. There's a big question mark over it, in the sense that we have to decide or determine whether this was an act of murder or an act of terrorism.
Right.
And I think that's a really important question, Stephen, because if it's proven that this flight was taken down by rebels in eastern Ukraine, and if nations decided to categorize, therefore, those rebels as terrorists, what that would actually mean is that the families of the victims would be able to pursue anybody or any organization or any nation that supplied funds or equipment to the terrorists. So what that would mean is that potentially, if they were found, if it was determined that it was the rebels, and if it was also determined that the Kremlin or Russia had been supplying the rebels or the terrorists, if they were categorized that way, then the families of these victims would have a legal case against Russia. That's if these things are proven, but we know already that there's a lot of debate, there's a lot of very confusing information, and then this information released by the Russians saying that, well, this plane was being followed by Ukrainian military jets.
That's what bothers me about this entire situation, is there's so much mystery about it. The fact that it was a missile and not, for instance, a malfunction of the craft itself, I think is pretty obvious from the astrology of this chart, given the dynamics of Mars and the lunar node. Mars is pretty much conjunct the second house cusp, only 4 degrees away, but it's still, by sign, it's placed in Libra, the sign of the ascendant. This is traditionally always kind of bad. Now, what interests me about this chart is the 11th house of diplomacy and allies and things of that nature. It's in Leo. Leo is traditionally associated with France, and France has been making overtures toward increased or improved diplomacy with Russia here in the past few weeks and months. There's a come to light a deal, I do believe, where France is selling arms to Russia or wants to sell them arms.
And the UK as well, and their Prime Minister David Cameron has spoken up very much. He speaks up very quickly, to be honest with you, and that's not necessarily a compliment. He spoke up very quickly about his opinions on the new leader of the European community, and got himself into hot water there. But he spoke up very quickly against Russia. But I haven't heard, and I followed this in detail, I haven't heard a lot of evidence. I've heard a lot of debate, a lot of speculation, but we seem to be very weak on evidence in this case at the moment. But he spoke up against the Russians, and then there was all this debate about France supplying military equipment to Russia, and then there were reports that the British were doing the same, and then David Cameron made another statement saying, that the trade does not breach the embargo. So all very, very strange and seemingly very hypocritical, potentially.
Yes, that's what I meant last week when I spoke about the lack of any political potency in the European Union. The European Union lacks the centralized authority to counter this disturbing trend of Russia's improved diplomatic relations with the West. This is, in my opinion, this is sort of a worst-case scenario. This is exactly what the United States does not want to happen, i.e. Russia gaining more influence in the EU. We could have a situation where Russia dominates the EU. We could have a situation, for example, where Russia absorbs NATO into itself or dominates NATO somehow. These are potentials. However, do I think they'll happen? Well, not in the near future, at least. I expect Russia to have a fairly crappy 2014, based upon their solar return chart, which we'll probably get to in a bit. But noticing though that Scorpio. In the crash chart, or not the crash chart, but the takeoff chart, Scorpio represents the investigation itself. Scorpio is investigation, as is Pluto, its modern ruler, so-called modern ruler. And Scorpio is in the third sign. The second sign from the ascendant. Okay, the Scorpio comes right after Libra. So the investigation, I think, being associated with the second sign, the second house, as it is, I think the investigation is probably going to be quite pricey because of the conflict. And Scorpio also is a sign of butchery and bloodletting due to its Mars rulership. So the investigation is a result of Mars. But Mars in Libra, conjunct the North Node, likewise, is also going to be a result of the investigation. So I would expect this to perturb conflicts and ill will in the area. You mentioned the inability to have any clarity or lucidity in the situation. Mercury conjunct the midheaven is in Cancer. This is going to obscure the incisive lucidity that Mercury is usually known for in other signs. That's going to be clouded by the emotions. The cardinality and the cardinal emotions of Cancer are going to obscure that. That's how we can get a 2-hour-long press conference from that Russian general. I did not watch it in its entirety, so I don't know what the gist of that press conference was.
Well, I'll tell you, Stephen, I watched the whole thing, and it was very fact-based. It was not some emotional or seemingly political statement or dialogue. It seemed to be very much based upon the facts of the flight and information that is available. And so I found that very interesting. And you see, when it comes to the Western information about this flight, that there just aren't enough facts. It's most odd, and I think that you're right about Mercury in this chart, because Mercury in this flight chart, it forms a square to the moon being the common people, these poor people that perished in this dreadful catastrophe. that the moon, these people, is squared, which is an obstacle, by Mercury, the theme of communication. And to me, that describes the fact that this is very political. The focus should be upon the fact that these people died, and to determine what caused this dreadful incident. But there seems to be so much political manoeuvring that I personally find quite distasteful. And so going back to that square between the moon, the people involved in this, and Mercury, the square indicates that what's being said is not necessarily about or for the benefit of these people that perished. And then also we have Mercury forming an opposition to Pluto, which also implies that there's something very, very underhand about what occurred here, and there's something potentially very underhand about what is being said and reported and what is not. It's all very cloak and dagger.
Yeah, I think that's a direct manifestation of Mercury in a water sign, partially. I think there are other dynamics at play for that as well. Note that Mercury sign of Virgo is on the 12th house of this chart. The 12th house is secrecy, is cloak and dagger sort of material. However, Mercury's in a very public position. Conjunct the midheaven, that's about as public as you can get. It's on the angle. So, I would expect what Mercury signifies to be very visible. And, hey, this guy, he can deal in facts. I mean, Mercury definitely deals in facts, but Mercury in Cancer is going to want to, I think, be more... What springs to mind, and the term you keep coming across in the literature, is stump speeches. The type of political types of speech that rallies the less primitive strata of society. You see, that's what Mercury in Cancer is sort of known for. And at 4 degrees Cancer and 46 minutes, Mercury's in the bounds of Mars, the terms of Mars. So this brings that into play as well, the intrinsic nature of Mars in Cancer. Mars in Cancer is very cowardly, but when it does take action, it does so very cruelly. You see, Mars in Cancer doesn't want to fight. The water dilutes Mars's nature. However, once it does lashes out, it can be quite cruel. But the bound ruler being Mars indicates to me the subject, rather, of Mercury's speech, Martian types of things, military things. Who fired the missiles, what kind of missiles they were, and things of that nature. Mercury in Cancer is ruled by the sign ruler. The sign ruler is the moon, conjunct the 7th house cusp, which also sort of ratchets up the explosive factor in this configuration. And they're, like you mentioned, they're in square to one another, with the moon applying to that square. I would expect the situation shown by this chart, the evolution of it, based upon that square of the moon to Mars, and based upon the fact that it's applying, especially, I would expect the more incendiary features of this problem, maybe perhaps to worsen over time. This is sort of like tinder or kindling on the big bonfire that is Slavic politics.
Well, it's interesting as well that Pluto, the planet of crime and the underworld, is tucked away, hidden away under the horizon at the base of the chart, right, in opposition to the midheaven, in opposition to what's known by the public, what's in the public domain. So I found that very interesting, Stephen. But when I was looking at the houses for the chart and the power of the houses, the power of the planets, the power of the signs of the zodiac, I found that to be very revealing as well, because the first house in the chart is a powerful house. It's the third most powerful house, and we know that it represents largely the physical element of the entity. And also, when we look at whether it's harmonious or discordant, we see that it's enormously discordant. and I mean shockingly discordant. When you glance at the houses and the data, considering the power and the discord, the one that screams at you as a problem is the first house. So again, if you were considering taking this flight and you saw as an astrologer that powerful and hugely discordant first house, you would say there's very much a physical risk here, and therefore I am not stepping foot on this flight. But also the two most powerful signs of the zodiac in the chart, Cancer firstly, and then Libra secondarily, and Mars thirdly actually, they're all wildly discordant as well. And, you know, given that this was a flight, therefore we would look at the air element amongst other things, but the air element is massively discordant too. And, you know, then when we look at the energies, the cardinal energy, the fixed energy, and the mutable energy, the fixed and the mutable being self-explanatory, but cardinal being that pioneering, initiating, powerfully dynamic energy that can really cause something to occur, you see that this chart is 62.7% cardinal, and the cardinal energy is off the chart in terms of its discord. So you just wouldn't step foot on this flight if you were an astrologer and you had this data.
Absolutely. I mean, for one thing, right off the bat, you can tell let's suppose that, you know, your client comes to you and they're like, I got this vacation where I'm flying out from Schiphol Airport, you know, I'm MH17, etc., yada, yada, and this is the chart for when it's going to take off time, etc. Okay, fine. I would point out, I would say, look, there's, you know, Saturn's sign is on the 5th house of recreation. Yeah, I mean, that's like screaming party pooper. That's screaming, you know, I'm gonna pee all over your parade, dude.
And Uranus as well, and that Uranus conjunct the South Node is alarming.
Right. So I would tell the person first off right off the bat, you're gonna have a crappy vacation. Is there any way you can get out of this? You know. Now, of course, looking at the configuration of Mars with the nodal axis in the first house in Libra. That would concern me as well in terms of physical safety. That would be a ding red flag right there. You know, Mars is ruled. I mean, first of all, Mars is in the sign of his detriment in Libra, and that's why I said earlier that he represents sort of bungling and incompetent generals, incompetent leadership, or bungling, or even reluctant leadership. You know, Mars. In the sign of Libra, if you think about it, that's really sort of a contradictory type of vibe, you know? Libra is about harmony. So what we have here is a Mars that fights for peace, which is really contradictory considering the subject we're talking about here, which is a plane crash, which is a military armament used in bringing down a commercial jet. You see what I mean? So this is this is really puzzling. This is what I'm going to be keeping my eye out for as the situation unfolds. Now, you mentioned Pluto in the 4th house. The 4th house is very secretive as well, just by nature. I mean, it's at the nadir of the chart. You know, it's underneath the Earth. It represents by nature things that are unseen in the origins. And Pluto is a modern ruler of Scorpio. So we see here Pluto opposed to Mercury, the god of perception and knowledge. Pluto is opposed to that, and Pluto rules the investigation because Scorpio is a natural significator for investigation. You see what I mean, Steve?
Absolutely. And even I know when I looked at the aspects in the chart, so the aspects between the different planets, the worst, the most powerful aspect is that square between Mars, accidents, missiles, and the Sun, the very essence or path of the entity or mission, and that screams problem. So yeah. I think in a nutshell, what we're saying to people is that it's very clear that this was a problematic flight, and if we were considering taking this flight, we would have decided not to.
Oh yeah, I think I'm seeing a situation that I'm expecting maybe to worsen as time goes on. The square between Mars and the Sun is an applying one, very tight, only 51 minutes away from being exact. This is significant. So, you know, this signifies in natal astrology, rather, you know, how an influence that's going to assert itself as the life progresses. In horary astrology, which is just sort of judging a question, answering a question based on the moment, then it represents something a little bit different. It represents basically what's going to happen in the future, whereas the separating aspects are looking backward, how the situation developed. So the fact that the square between Sun and Mars is applying, this sort of is another indicator that the situation is going to get worse. And how? I think it's going to get worse for France because the Sun rules Leo, and Leo is in the 11th house. Leo, I'm thinking, is probably a symbol for France. Again, in all the traditional texts, Leo is assigned to France. Aries, incidentally, is assigned to Britain. So we have Britain on the 7th house of partners. I'm sure it's not an antagonistic relationship, at least not now. But again, with the moon also in a waxing or applying square to Mercury, then it will be interesting to see how that develops too, because the moon is lodged in Aries. So maybe it would surprise me if there might be some British passengers on this flight as well. Schiphol Airport is not that far at all away from.
There were some, but obviously there was a huge number of Dutch passengers, and just really upsetting. It really upsets me as well as a Brit. It upsets me that we're selling arms to Russia, and not necessarily. Not purely because of this flight, because it isn't proven that the Russians were involved. And again, I'm not saying that they weren't. I'm saying I haven't seen evidence yet that the Russians were involved. So there's a lot of finger pointing, but we haven't seen the evidence. But we do know for a fact that Russia annexed Crimea. This is known, and that was completely inappropriate and illegal. But we're still selling arms to them. It's just a complete double standard here. There really is. That upsets me, and it upsets me particularly as a Brit. I've sent you, Stephen, another chart that is very much part of this equation with MH17, and it brings Russia into the picture. So we've got a tri-wheel, 3 charts in one. And I'm saying this for the benefit of the listeners, but we have on the inner wheel the flight, then on the middle wheel we have Russia's natal chart, and then on the outer wheel we have Russia's progressed chart. And this is very interesting.
Yes, it is. I'm looking at that chart now. I love the bi-wheels and tri-wheels and quad wheels and quinqui wheels, just because of their ability to compress a truly insane amount of situation. But, they give you sort of a topological appreciation of what's happening. And, at first it's really, really confusing. And just seeing this profusion of symbols arrayed on the circle as it is in various combinations really helps you to admire the complexity of fate and destiny, doesn't it, Steve?
Oh, I always say to people, all information is available. All of it. All information is available. The challenge for us is, how much time have you got? How much time have you got, and how much brain power does anybody have to actually understand, interpret, digest all of the information that's available?
Sure.
It's just, it's fascinating. But this chart, Stephen, have you received the chart?
I have. I'm looking at it now.
Okay. Really very interesting that the midheaven of the Russian chart is conjunct the south node of the flight chart.
Yeah.
Which, as a minimum, says that this flight is very, very unfortunate for Russia's reputation. But it could be a factor indicating that Russia was somehow involved. I don't think that the people that shot down this plane realized it was a commercial flight.
Right.
I don't think that's the case. I don't feel that that's the case. But regardless, if you're shooting down a plane, you're potentially killing somebody. But that conjunction of the midheaven in the Russian natal chart and the south node, that very unfortunate point in the flight chart, suggests that potentially there is some involvement. But what's even more shocking is that the south node in the Russian chart is right at the midheaven of the flight chart, and it is in opposition to Pluto. So we need to look at some other charts, the Ukrainian chart. There is even a theory, Stephen, and you know this, but I'm saying it to you because you're the only person to talk to on this show. No, I don't mean that in a rude way. It sounds a bit rude, doesn't it? You're the only person to talk to.
No, I like it.
I know, but what I mean is, I say things to you that are the blatantly obvious to you, but I say them to you for the benefit of our listeners,
right.
Because you're the person I can dialogue with. But there is a theory that this was another false flag operation in order to really put heat on Russia. Now, my stomach churns at the thought of that, the thought that anybody could be so dreadful as to do this for political means. But Putin did say, well, how strange that this occurs just after we did the BRICS deal. So we mentioned BRICS last week, but for the benefit of anybody that's listening that wasn't listening to last week's show, the Russian Federation signed a deal with other nations, and it's the BRICS deal: Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and the deal is to create an alternative reserve currency. It's a huge flipping of the bird to the US and the West. And Putin did say, how interesting that just after we made that agreement, just after we flipped the bird, we now have this situation in which the Russians are being accused of involvement in this dreadful tragedy with this passenger jet. So I'm not saying that this is what happened. I'm saying these are things that have been said. These are things being discussed in the public domain. But seeing the north node of the Russian natal chart and the sun of the progressed Russian chart conjunct Pluto in the flight chart, and then also the south node of the Russian chart conjunct the midheaven in this chart, it does imply that, well, you'll give your interpretation as well, Stephen, but to me it suggests that there is some blood on Russia's hands.
Well, I want to point out that in support of that theory, the midheaven degree of the crash chart is partile conjunct, meaning conjunct to the degree not only of Russia's south node, but lamentably Russia's 12th house cusp, right?
Mm-hmm.
Russia, and this is an automatic, this is a theme that we're going to develop more richly later, because it becomes more important when we analyze Russia's solar returns for 2014. 2014, they're going to have the 12th house emphasized in the solar return. Let's just say that, and it's going to, I think, be fairly tough on Russia, and by extension, probably the world as well. So 2014 is something to watch out for Russia.
And does this chart, though, to you, this tri-wheel, to you, does it give you the feeling that Russia was indeed somehow involved, even if it's just providing equipment to the rebels, not knowing what they would do with it?
Of course. What I think is that Russia's going to gain from this, because they're in the Russian birth figure, the part of fortune is in the 12th house. Part of fortune represents financial gain, and it's in the 12th house. So right off the bat, that's a bold statement that Russia, the part of fortune in Russia's birth figure promises financial gains through 12th house activities. What are those? Illegal things, secret things, things having to do with hospitals and prisons and confinement, things having to do with secret enemies, espionage, These are, and also things having to do with mysticism. Rasputin springs to mind. The 12th house is also the 12th house of mysticism. It also pertains to the planes beyond the material, because the 12th sign is Pisces. This is a modern convention relating the house numbers to the zodiac sequence. The traditional astrologers didn't do this, but looking at this chart, what I can say is, maybe not speaking on culpability, I can say that Russia stands to gain financially from this. And maybe, for that reason, maybe I'm premature in judging the 12th house year for coming up for Russia as being negative or bad. Maybe I'm premature in that, because this could be a situation where the 12th house for Russia is configured to be accidentally good. Bad for us, but good. It could be. In other words, it could be saying, "Hey, Russia's going to benefit financially through espionage."
It's interesting as well that the sun in the Russian chart, the leadership, well, the president, the government in Russia, that sun is in opposition to the part of fortune in the flight chart, and that's unfortunate. And then also the fact that that Mercury in the natal Russian chart is in opposition to the part of fortune, that suggests that the truth is not being told with regard to this flight, or that the Russians are not telling the truth with regard to this flight.
Yes, if we use the technique of profections, then 2013 was an 11th house profected year, and the 11th house refers to things like diplomacy. It refers to things also like one's cabinet, such as the Duma, the legislative body of the government, the 11th house. And this is in the sign of Gemini, a sign of trickery and deceit. So on the one hand, it says, hey, the Russians are going to be, the topic that's elevated for Russia this year is going to be, on the one hand, business dealings, Gemini, with diplomatic partners, the 11th house, facilitated by the Duma, the Russian Congress, for lack of more political sophistication on my part. And also, it's going to be wrapped up in trickery and deceit because of the ruler Mercury's position in Sagittarius, the sign of its detriment. So the ruler is hurt, the sign's going to be hurt. So that tells me right off the bat that in 2013, Russia's going to step on some toes in its effort to establish trade and in its effort to deceive its partners, and also to deceive the legislative body of Russia, however that works. So that means next year is going to be a 12th house profected year. Now here's the repetition of the 12th house theme that I spoke of earlier. Let's not forget the midheaven of the MH17 crash is at 7 degrees of Cancer, very much conjunct the Russian 12th house in Cancer. Very much conjunct that, and also very much conjunct the Russian South Node at 11 degrees Cancer. You see. Very much close to that as well. So this is going to lend the MH17 saga a very public nature that I don't think that, maybe Russia might even benefit from that, but since the nature of the South Node is malefic, so ultimately it might be sort of an evening out factor. They might benefit financially, but I think the slur that they take to their reputation might actually slow down their plans at dominating the West through the EU and NATO and through other means, through greater resource grabbing in South America, thanks to BRICS, and even Africa. So all of this I think might be compromised, believe it or not, by this one crash. There's certainly the threat to that. So on the one hand, it's good for Russia, but on the other hand, the long-term consequences are quite bad. The solar return for 2013 has an ascendant in Scorpio, the sign ruled by Mars. So that right there speaks of violence all throughout the solar year for Russia. It's about to conclude in the beginning of December 2014, and that's when they enter into a new solar year. It's sort of like a customized New Year's celebration for them astrologically. And here we have Capricorn rising, which is in the sign, and very close we have we have 12 or 13 degrees of Capricorn rising, so that's also probably conjunct Pluto. Let me double check in the crash chart. Yeah, that Pluto's at 11 Capricorn. Well, that's where Russia's ascendant is going to be in the solar return year of 2014.
How interesting.
Yeah. And the fourth house, so that's the end of the matter. The fourth house represents the end of things. So that tells me 2014. Now, when I say 2014, remember the parameters of that year for Russia stretch from the birthday in December, all the way to the birthday in December of 2015. That's the year for Russia, astrologically speaking. Do you see? Right?
Yeah, and also I think it's worth telling people, Stephen, that that's one of the techniques we use to look at a client's outlook for the year. We run a solar return for their birthday, and we see we can break down the different compartments of their life for that period. But equally, we can do that for a nation. So this is a fascinating exercise. Shall we look at the flight in the context of Ukraine?
Absolutely.
Because again, you see, I'm intrigued by the fact that this statement by the Russians that this flight was being followed by 2 Ukrainian military aircraft. Now, the Ukrainians are saying that's not the case. The president said all of our military aircraft was grounded at the time of this flight. But what are the facts? I mean, that there must be a way of proving whether or not this flight was being followed by another 2 aircraft.
Yeah, I know. And I think that actually poses a problem in and of itself, Steve, because I did hear one authority. I assume the person was an authority. Is one of these. It wasn't a journalist. It was a military professional in on the Russian side, and he did raise a very good point. You know, the fact that the Buk anti-aircraft system is of this or that origin is pretty much immaterial because a variety of people can get their hands on these weapons. You know, so that doesn't really, you know, the fact that it was a Buk, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, you know, doesn't really establish the origin, you know, or really the trigger man or woman, you know, of the launch. But the chart, in my opinion, does the cause of that. You know, let me see.
Well, I think one of the issues, Stephen, is whether there are a couple of issues in my mind. Firstly, is the Buk missile system a system that was already in Ukraine, or is it a missile system that was brought across the border from Russia into Ukraine? So that's the first question that is unanswered in my mind. And the second question in my mind is, were the rebels in eastern Ukraine actually able to use this Buk missile system? Because apparently it takes considerable training and a number of people to operate this system. So the question in my mind is, could some of these rebels already have known how to operate this Buk missile system, in which case they could have just done this themselves, or were they not people who could operate a Buk missile system, which then leads to the question, well, then who helped them to use it? So again, a lot of unanswered questions, but I don't understand why in this day and age it's so difficult to answer the questions like, were there or were there not 2 Ukrainian military aircraft in the air and on the same flight path as this flight? Surely to goodness in this day and age we have access to that information, and surely to goodness in this day and age we can answer the question, could any of these rebels be people that knew how to operate a Buk missile system? Just a yes or a no. And that helps us to determine whether they could have done this themselves or whether they must have had some training or support from the Russians. I don't understand why in this day and age we can't just answer those questions.
Well, I'll tell you what, astrologically, in my opinion, we can. The Ukrainian Mars, and representing, in addition to the army, but representing in addition to the military, the sort of national aggressive impulse. It's in Virgo, a sign of technology. So right off the bat, the astrological answer is a yes. The Ukrainian resistance has the technological moxie to pull this off. So that's what I would expect.
But is that because they already had it, or because they acquired it from the Russians? I mean, the authorities in the Ukraine, I'm not sure whether it was the president, but
right.
An authority in the Ukraine said this missile was launched by a Russian military commander. There must have been involvement. And I think that there was even a telephone conversation intercepted, so they say. But then the Russians were talking about the video. I tell you what really shocked me. I was watching a lot of CNN coverage, and there were a number of experts involved in the debate, Stephen, and one of them was a U.S. military commander.
Right.
And he said, and he didn't get much airtime at all, but with the little airtime he was given, he said, how incredible is it that this has just occurred and we have video footage of this missile system being transported? How on earth, what a coincidence. How far beyond coincidence, not only that there was video footage taken of this missile system being transported, but that it's all of a sudden available straight after this event. How bizarre. And this is pretty much what he said, and he didn't really get to say much more, but it made me scratch my head as well. And again, I'm not saying I have a view on what happened. My view right now is there's so much confusing and conflicting information that it's very difficult to figure out what on earth went on here, but there are some very bizarre reports.
Well, I think to counter that, and I do believe the Buk anti-aircraft missile system, I want to say, I could be wrong, that it was sold to Ukraine by Russia back in the 70s. However, what's interesting to note, you provided me with that a very engaging tri-wheel, thank you, and it looks to me, correct me if I'm wrong, please.
And this is just tell everybody which chart that is.
Well, we have a tri-wheel here. On the inner wheel, we're comparing, we have the crash chart, the chart for the takeoff of poor doomed MH17. On the middle wheel, we have the Ukrainian national figure, and on the outer wheel, I'm thinking we have the Ukrainian progressed figure to the time of the crash. Now, what's interesting to me is look at the progressed Ukrainian Mars. That's very, very. I mean, that's
at 9 degrees Libra.
Right. It's in the same sign as the crash Mars. As far as I'm concerned, this is very telling. This is very, very telling. This is the cause of the investigation signified by Scorpio, because Mars rules Scorpio. It's also the cause of the denial of that investigation, represented by Saturn's placement in Scorpio. Do you see? So now, what a few options we have here. Is this engineered by the Russians? Did Ukraine do it, or some radical faction in the Ukrainian government do it? Maybe another balancing sort of testimony in favor of this coming internally from the Ukraine is the idea, or the notion that MH17 had deviated some 200 kilometers north of its flight path, directly over the troubled area of Donetsk. People should realize Donetsk right now is a wild card. It's a rogue state. It's not recognized by Russia.
It's like, you just don't want to fly over the north of Iraq or Syria now.
It's a European North Korea. I mean, maybe not so much in terms of ideology, but in terms of safety and security. Absolutely. It's wild. It's new. What we have here are people brimming with nationalism, and they can get their hands on weaponry. So, and they're technically in the territory of Ukraine. They're not recognized by any honorable country. America certainly doesn't recognize them as a legitimate government. So they have they have an illegitimate tang about them. You see, and so this could represent Mars's debility in the sign of Libra. The Donetsk army isn't going to be, represented in terms of action figures anytime soon. You know what I'm saying? It's not going to have a good image.
I noticed that the part of fortune in the Ukrainian chart is conjunct it's not exactly conjunct, but it is conjunct nonetheless the Sun in the flight chart and Jupiter in the flight chart, which possibly describes the fact that this great tragedy somehow does benefit the Ukraine in that it brings a lot of attention back to the issues in the Ukraine. Because if you think of it, we had this situation in which there were problems in the Ukraine, and then Russia annexed Crimea, and there was international outrage about Russia actually doing that. How dare they actually do that in this day and age? And then we had the situation with Iraq and ISIS really moving in from the east of Syria into northern Iraq and taking territory, chopping people's heads off, which they're still doing, and declaring this Islamic Caliphate. So that was at the top of the headlines. So Ukraine sort of lost some attention on the international stage, and then Iraq seemed to lose focus in terms of media coverage because the Israelis decided to go into the Gaza Strip, which we need to talk about again this evening. And so there was attention drawn away from the whole problematic dynamic in the Ukraine. And so this flight being downed, this dreadful occurrence, somehow benefits the Ukraine in that it brings attention back to the problems in the Ukraine and these rebels in the east and the possible involvement of Russia in the disquiet in the eastern part of Ukraine, and also the huge Russian military build-up on the border. And in fact, the Pentagon said today that they're pretty certain the Russians are about to cross the border into eastern Ukraine.
Yeah. I think that's actually an outstanding and very astute observation that, public perception of this event is going to be important here, because Venus, representing the body of the plane itself, being the symbol of the plane, it's in the ninth sign from the ascendant. The ninth sign is the house of God. It's a very crude sort of symbology saying, hey, Venus is in heaven, the fuselage is in heaven, the plane is in heaven, so to speak. It's in the house of God. That's what happens to the plane. And Mercury rules Venus, because Venus is in the sign of Gemini, which is Mercury's sign. So, in other words, we can say that Mercury in Cancer is the cause of Venus, because Mercury rules Venus. And remember, we also have this mirror sort of synchronicity at work, where the planet that that rules another planet is also in its turn caused by the planet it rules. So Venus in Gemini is in effect going to cause Mercury in Cancer, this smeary sort of emotionally charged perception, to come into play as well. So there's going to be a sympathy factor, I think, that obfuscates and confuses the issue and further reduces the clarity. Mercury in Cancer, sort of represents a depressed sort of communication, and Venus in the ninth house of God there pretty much is both the result and the cause of the communication problem signified by Mercury in Cancer. So I think your comments regarding perception and the way this thing is communicated to the international community. And, I think that's a very important observation, because it's encoded into this crash chart, you see. And it also shows some of the outcome of this tragedy.
Yeah, I do think in summary, looking at the synastry between the flight chart and the Ukraine, versus the flight chart in Russia, I'm more inclined to say that there's some dastardly dealing on the Russian side.
The sun?
The Russian side.
Let me pull back.
When I look at the synastry between the flight chart in Russia versus flight chart in the Ukraine,
right,
my feeling is that this event somehow benefits the Ukraine because it brings a lot of international attention to the problem that the Ukrainians face. But the synastry between the flight and Russia gives me a stronger feeling that there is some involvement on the Russian side, even if it was just the provision of funds or equipment to support the rebels in the east of the Ukraine. Because again, you see, going back to the issue with the Ukraine and Russia, the Russians claim that they have not been supporting the rebels.
Right. Yeah, that's. I don't think we can. I think we can conclude that this is not the case.
Yeah.
I really do think that based upon the dynamics, the configuration of the node, of Russia's south node with the crash charts midheaven. That's one big significator, and also that same midheaven for the crash is right in Russia's 12th house. So that smacks of illegality, makes it a criminal act. The moon rules this criminal act, and the moon is in Aries, conjunct the 7th house of the crash. So obviously it's an opponent of the plane. Not to say that it's an opponent of Malaysia per se, but it's an opponent of perhaps the people who might be outraged at an atrocity committed against a Malaysian craft, the Dutch, the English, the West, people in the Westerners, the punishment of the West in general. So we can use the detective's ploy. Who would benefit the most from the West, taking some egg on their face for this murder? And Russia would benefit the most from that. They, again, their inclination to expand is going to benefit from this. But I really do think it's going to turn around and bite them in the butt. I think they underestimated the public relations consequences that are going to backlash after this. I think they underestimated that.
Yeah, it's going to be very interesting to see how it unfolds, and I'm sure we must follow up on this more in our show next week. Shall we move on, Stephen, and explore some other challenges? So it's been a dreadful time for travel because a flight went down in Taiwan, and then also a flight went down in Africa. Yeah. And it seems that there's the French are saying that it seems the flight in Africa went down because of weather, extremely bad weather. But then obviously we've got this situation between Israel and Palestine raging away. ISIS is still stomping their way around Iraq and doing all kinds of damage. We still have some military advisors in Iraq, but I'm not sure about you. I still don't. And honestly, Stephen, I have to say, I feel that on foreign policy, the U.S., and I say we because I live in the U.S., I feel that we're very weak. I feel that we're very impotent on foreign policy. So that's not an astrological observation, it's my opinion, but I really feel that we're very impotent on the international scene, even when it just comes to our influence over Israel.
Yeah, our street cred is suffering a hit right now, as it were. Definitely we need to reform ourselves in that regard and start making better policy decisions as far as foreign relations go, but I think before that we need to focus on some domestic reforms that I think would render foreign reforms to be more long-lasting and more effective. You know what I mean? In other words, it's going to be difficult for us to make overtures of reconciliation to the Germans when we still conduct draconian NSA surveillance programs here in our home soil.
Oh, well, they've already decided that they're going to start counter-espionage anyway.
Right. So now, all of a sudden, thanks to this, if you're wondering, well, what does this have to do with me? It's thanks to this. If you purchase the Rosetta Stone to learn German, for purely academic reasons or because you want to, because you were under the impression that you didn't wake up in Iran this morning, you could do what the hell you wanted. Well, guess what? Now they have an excuse to be interested in you. You're learning German. Maybe you're gonna cavort with spies. You're gonna be a double agent.
Or maybe you're gonna work for the NSA.
Right.
They love linguists apparently.
Yeah, they love all sorts of smart people. That's the scary thing about it. So the American public as a collective, as a body that can influence legislation, it's going to have to exert its influence to rein in these sorts of forces in American politics. There's just no two ways about that. And then perhaps we'll have a shot at improving our foreign policy. But you're right. We definitely need to clean our act up. Turkey is going the wrong way.
It really, honestly, if I had to summarize it, Stephen, I'd say, if somebody said to me, can you summarize the American involvement abroad at the moment? My honest view would be, well, we don't seem to be doing much about major issues like ISIS, Israel, Palestine, and I don't think we're doing much there simply because we don't really have much credibility in that. And in addition to not doing much about the world's biggest problems, despite trying, we're not delivering much in terms of results, it seems. But in addition to this, we're pissing off our allies.
Yeah. Turkey.
So we're busy pissing off our allies and not really doing much about the big problems.
Yes, we would do well to have engaged in more intimate and tighter diplomacy with Turkey. But instead, in my opinion, they're going in the wrong direction. If we're not careful, we're going to wind up with two Irans in that region, because Turkey can just as easily swing the other way. It's versatile. I can easily envisage a fundamentalist, i.e., radicalized Turkey. Now, ISIS, they're definitely someone to watch because, they're engaging in perhaps the most odious behavior of the extremists, of the religious extremists, of the Islamic religious extremists, the defacement of the other religion's holy site. We saw this with the Taliban blowing up those precious Buddha statues, and we see it now with ISIS destroying the tomb of Jonah, Jonah in the well, a shrine to both Christians and Muslims. Well, now it's rubble. Who knows? I mean, it's just that infuriates me. As far as I'm concerned, now they've crossed the line. As far as I'm concerned, this is an assault on the culture of a people, and it's a different type of crime. So they definitely merit attention. What are we doing to dismantle their little jihadist trailer park over there going on in the Levant right now? What are we doing about that? Is it apparently our policy to just sort of let it fester and see what happens?
We've sent these advisors, haven't we? But they're still taking territory. Well,
the advisors might not understand the dynamics of the Iraqi Mars and South Node configuration in Aries. They might not realize that. If they did, they'd realize that the Iraqi army, as an archetype, let's just say, has a couple of strikes against it. It has to ride the short bus, to coin a modern parlance. It's not that good, just from an astrological perspective. It's a degraded sort of Mars. And so they, know that. And I'm pulling up the Israel-Palestine chart here. I'm looking at, Steve, what is apparently a quad wheel. Oh, man, this is great. This is
a quinquewheel.
Oh, man. There are 5 rings on this baby.
Yeah, so inner wheel is Palestine, natal chart. Then the second wheel is Palestine progressed, showing us where the planets are positioned at this point in time for Palestine. So how Palestine's as an entity, how it's evolved since its inception,
right,
to the current time. Then we've got the Israeli natal chart in third position. Fourth wheel is Israel progressed, and the final wheel is transiting planets. And you can see again that conjunction now of the south node in Israel's chart to Pluto in Palestine's chart. No surprise that there's big trouble at the moment, but we can see that Mars creeping in, Stephen, to trigger that eclipse point in the middle of August.
Oh.
Very, very troubling dynamics.
Yes, that is. I'm actually just sort of digesting the Palestinian charts here. This is a chart that is rather remarkable. I'm not quite as familiar with it as I am with the Israeli national figure, but the Mars is quite interesting. At 1 degree Aries, it's in very good zodiacal condition, and it's by now progressed to 10 degrees of Aries. Oh man, how interesting is that? 10 degrees of Aries. Mars in Aries is going to be quite aggressive, quite bold, but at the 10th degree, this is in the bounds of Venus. Venus as a significator for Islam, so it shows what Mars is going to be fighting for, Islam. Yes,
Stephen, remind us, because you've told us before, but you just said Venus is a significator of Islam. Which is a significator of Judaism?
Saturn. Due to
Saturn.
Right,
okay.
right. Due to the fact that Judaism is the oldest of the religions practiced in the West today. It is the root of both Christianity and Islam. We have Judaism first. Judaism is nothing less than the very first monotheistic religion. You know, it provided us with the loftiest spiritual ideas of our time, and it gave rise first to Christianity, and then and later on to Islam. And Jupiter represents Christians, Saturn represents Jews in Judaism, and Venus is a significator for Islam. Do you see? And the Palestinian natal figure, we have Venus very much in the sign she rules, which is Libra in the first house. So this is a good Venus. This to me is saying, wow, you know, Palestine, the Palestinian cause is going to be represented by this Venus. And it could also represent Palestine, or Philistine as it's called by the natives or the speakers of Arabic. It also, I think, represents the image that Palestine holds to the rank and file Muslim, wherever he may be in the modern Islamic diaspora, be he in the UK, be he in Manchester, be he in Knoxville, you know, or be he in Mexico City or in Medina. You know, the face of Islam as represented by Palestine, the struggle, as it were, the movement of Palestine is very attractive, as shown by Venus in the first house. To have the ascendant ruler in the ascendant is by itself a boon, a good thing. And to have that same ascendant ruler in the sign that it rules, you know, dignified in such a way by being in the sign that it rules, man, that's even better. Venus is in the terms of Jupiter. Now, you guys might be saying, wow, it doesn't really, you know, seem like Palestine is undergoing, you know, is enjoying all of these benefits described by Venus.
There is more support for Palestine, though. There have even been suggestions by the Israelis that the Western media is being unfair to Israel by focusing too much upon civilian deaths in Palestine.
Right.
But
look at what house she rules, Venus. Well, look at what house. Now, Venus is a symbol for Palestine specifically because she's in the first house. She rules the ascendant. She's the ascendant lord. The ascendant is the ship that you sail in. It's your body. And in national charts, it represents, you know, the nation. And Venus, as this symbol, also rules the sign of Taurus, which is on the 8th house, the sign of death. And so, being at such a huge quantity in a power, being angular, it really it represents a morbid streak here. There's a very, very real lethality to this Venus because she rules the sign of death. Do you see?
Mm-hmm.
But she's getting money too because Taurus is. Now the question is, and it's kind of hard to see with the Quincke wheel. What I'd like to do is look at some of natal Venus's aspects to other bodies in the natal.
Natal figure for Palestine.
Right. We have the moon in a cardinal sign. We have the moon separating from a square with Venus. The moon in her fall in Capricorn, 4th house of homeland. So this shows ambition for the homeland right off the bat. This is promised, first of all, by the moon. It's promised by Saturn, which rules Capricorn, the sign of the 4th house cusp. The 4th house is the homeland. Saturn, everything's kind of squished in here. I'm looking for Saturn appears to be in the 3rd house.
I sent you the grid, actually, for Palestine.
Oh, a grid. Man, I don't know what it is about grids, but I just love grids. Maybe it's my Mercury in Virgo. So every time I see a grid, I just get a warm fuzzy. You know what I'm saying? I just feel good inside. Yeah, here we go. We got Saturn.
Grid for the world's biggest prison.
Yeah, for sure. Capricorn represents the prison, and to have your homeland in Capricorn would represent a rather austere environment, depending on the sign ruler, which is obviously Saturn. Saturn, on the surface, looks good being in Capricorn, but we've said before what's good for Saturn isn't necessarily good for the native, in this case, Palestine. Uranus, just tightly conjunct Saturn as well. Oh, man, that's going to be a really, really big party pooper. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and it's sort of an unusual form of cruelty.
Yeah, it's what it's going to
an unusual form of restriction, and that certainly is the case in Gaza.
Absolutely.
I mean, you can't leave there. It literally is the world's biggest prison, and there's a blockade. You can't even get the things that you would require.
That's what I think the most vital thing you said there was restriction. That's represented by Saturn, and yet Uranus, that's going to represent an increasing desire for freedom. So now we can understand the tension generated by this conjunction between Uranus and Saturn. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and Hamas is saying, I think it's important to remind people that Hamas is a terrorist organization. It's classed as a terrorist organization. They do launch rockets all the time at Israel, which is completely unacceptable. But Hamas aside, the people of Palestine suffer terribly. And it is an unusual and mystifying form of rigidity, restriction, described by that triple conjunction of Uranus, Saturn, and Neptune in the chart.
Now, Saturn represents restriction. Capricorn represents, and Saturn represents denial, rejection. Capricorn represents status. The moon, Palestine's moon, is in Capricorn. It wants status. It wants to have a voice. It wants to be recognized as a peer among nations. It wants its homeland because it's in the 4th house. And Saturn's denying that. Saturn is a force that is rejecting the Palestinian moon, representing the people, rejecting the lunar demands for status. You do not want to be a Palestinian living in Israel just from the civil rights perspective, not from the basic everyday security perspective. That's a nightmare. That's an unspeakable, unimaginable nightmare. But just from the civil rights perspective, it's a morass. It's full. The civil rights of Israel versus the Palestinians, I think, is commonly known by now that they contravene just about every basic modern standard of decency, recognized by every other sophisticated, civilized nation in the world. You don't want to be a Palestinian living in Israel, and this I don't mean to be criticizing so much, but it's just I'm saying it's shown there by Saturn and Capricorn, the rejection of the Capricornian status for Capricornian accumulated wealth. As far as real estate's concerned, Jesus Christ, you know what I mean? You don't want to be a real estate owner in Palestine. What you want to be is an insurance agent.
Is there any real estate left after this recent campaign?
Yeah. No, there's not.
There was a dreadful. There have been some absolutely dreadful cases this week in Palestine. A school was hit. Well, a school is clearly not a terrorist tagout, and that particular school was one that was being used as a safe location for Palestinians, for Gazans, and then a safe UN location was struck as well. There was one poor lady, Stephen, who was taken out of the rubble from one attack, and she lost her. She doesn't know. She's unconscious. She might even make it. Probably she would prefer not to make it if she knew what happened. She lost her children, her parents, and her siblings.
Yeah, unfortunately, it's almost a cliche, God forgive me for saying that, to see poor, battered, lifeless Palestinian children be pulled from the rubble and the parent wailing, questioning God, and etc., doing what one would expect a parent to do under such circumstances. You see that, and your rational mind, at first it sees a doll, a terribly abused and mistreated doll. But then, it hits you rationally that, hey, that inanimate object you just saw used to digest food, used to play with toys, was developing a relationship with the mother that gave him or her life. And so this is by far the most stunning and moving and probably the most useful in terms of the Palestinian cause. That's going to generate a lot of energy. It's going to generate a lot of support from other Muslims, and it goes into that Venus in Libra, highly dignified in the sign she rules. The traditional thinking on a planet in the sign that it rules is like someone in his or her own house. You're the boss there. If you want to pilfer through the cabinets, you can. Now, if you're in the sign of your exaltation, you don't get last night's leftover meatloaf. You get the salmon. You get the flambe for dessert. You know what I'm saying? But it would be highly inappropriate for you to wake up at midnight and start pilfering through the cupboards, wouldn't it? You know what I mean? You don't have the dignity of being in your own house. Still, you might eat better than the masters of the house that night because, rules of etiquette are that you give your guests the best. And so that's sort of what we have going on here. It's really, really fascinating for the Palestinian to analyze the Palestinian Venus in Libra. She's at home. And she's in the bound of Mars, I wanted to say. Let me double check that real quick. No, I'm sorry, in the bound of Jupiter. Lucky her. That makes her even more attractive. So the Palestinian cause is going to be even more attractive to all sorts of radicals of any stripe. It's going to gain traction among the leftists first. So you're going to have people like Oliver Stone and Sean Penn, Susan Sarandon et al. They've probably been rallying the Palestinian cause for a while. I'm not sure about that. I don't know. They work in an industry that's quite sensitive to political battle flags of that particular stripe. You know what I mean, Steve? Uh-oh. Steve, are you there? Did the NSA come and whisk you away? I bet they did. So, while we're waiting for Steve to come back, let's look at the profected year for 2013. This is very interesting. The profections. They're another type of predictive tool. What you do with profection is you move them around the zodiac. 1 degree equals 1 year. Okay? And so during 2013, for Israel, the ascendant was profected to the sign of Gemini. This is in Israel's chart. I'm sorry, to the sign of Aries. I do apologize. The natal sign of Aries is in the 6th house. So we would say it's a 6th house profected year for Israel. Right off the bat, this is going to be bad because the 6th house is a bad house. It represents sickness. It represents servitude. Do you see? And this is what Israel's going to be about this year. Now, what we do is we look at the ruler of the 6th house. It's Aries. The ruler is Mars. Okay, so Mars is Lord of the year. He's a time lord of the entire year. So what we want to do now is open up a solar return chart for 2013 to see what the year was like, because we're going to look at Mars's condition in that solar return. Right? Remember, Mars is Lord of the year, so his condition in the solar return is going to have a lot to say about the state of Israel throughout that year. Okay, so here's the solar return. Wow, for 2013. We've got Leo rising. That's sort of self-explanatory right there. Let me see. Steve, are you there, man? Poor fella, I think he may have lost his connection. Okay. I think he's having problems. I got Steve on the line right now, guys. All right. Man, I tell you, we've had some terrible weather here. At any rate, going back to Israel, we said they're having a sixth house year. Okay, so we now turn to the solar return chart for Israel. Okay, this is the perfected chart. Man, I've got chart overload here. This is what we're wanting. Okay, again, we said Leo is rising. First of all, let's find the Israeli ascendant in the solar return. This is going to give us more information about what the Israeli objective, what its agenda is for 2013, or was, I should say. And it's still going on. We're about probably midway through the year. The year for Israel begins on May 14th every year. That's when it has its birthday. Okay, so we have the early degrees of Scorpio. Aha, fourth house. Fourth house is an automatic and a very natural significator for war. Do you see? Fourth house represents the homeland, represents real estate, represents where you lay your head at night. It has the number 4 has a natural significance for manifestation and concreteness in reality. Do you see? So to have the solar return, fourth house to host the natal ascendant. It says that in 2013, the state of Israel is going to be very much concerned with its territory. Now, note also, in that solar return, Saturn occupies Scorpio. Saturn in the solar return in Scorpio is opposed to his natal place. This does not really bode well for the government at large, unfortunately, and we've seen Israel's public image take a hit. However, let's see, 2013, we still have some months left on that. Let's see what we got. I actually expect perhaps hostilities. Let me count real fast. We have May, June, July, July to August, September, October, November, December. Okay, May, June, July to August. Yeah, it will probably be later in the year when I think hostilities will get the worst, because in the solar return, Mars is in the 10th house, in the sign of Taurus, which is not good for Mars at all. Now let's see if we can isolate the month of that. Hold on, this is May to June, April to May, March to April, February to March. It's looking like, folks, not going to be a very good month for Israel this year. February to March, and this will be in 2015, right before Israel celebrates another birthday. So it could be, for example, Israel's enemies might be looking to hamper the birthday celebrations. I really should exit out of some of these charts that I don't need up, quite frankly. Okay, so the Israeli ascendant in the early degrees of Scorpio falls in the solar returns 4th house. The solar returns ascendants at 5 degrees of Leo. Oh, great. Now I can't. Okay, here we go. Israel is 5 degrees of Leo. Where are you? Oh, wow. Right there conjunct the Israeli midheaven. So that right there would say, hey, Israel is going to be in the news a lot more than it normally would be, without doubt. Let's see, where are we again? May, June, July to August. August to September. We keep talking about August in relation to this conflict. There are important transits going on in August. In addition, there are other signs and portents that are pointing out August as a trouble area. But in the solar return chart, August is highlighted as well. The period from roughly August the 14th right on up to September 14th, mid-September. In the solar return chart, this period of time is described by Saturn in Scorpio at 7 degrees retrograde. This was at the time of the solar return. Okay, so this was back in May 2013. Okay, so it's good until May of 2014. All right, moving on. I think hold on, Steve's trying to call me back here. He's having problems getting on, fellas. Man, what a bummer. I'll tell you what, I'm going to take Skype to task for all of this. Well, I lost my right-hand man. Unfortunately, I tell you, it really does stink sometimes to turn on the news and see all of the terrible things that are happening all across the globe. It really makes one wonder, where are we at in the great scheme of things? What does it all mean? Why are we going through this? It's, I think, the most important question, and it puzzles me. Sometimes I don't recognize the society into which I was born, and it's so complex. Our ancestors could not have dreamed up the sorts of problems that we face today. Tonight we've gone over certain of the hot spots: Ukraine, Eastern Europe, the rather mysterious crash of MH17, and the disturbing hostilities in Gaza. We certainly, the world would like to see that situation, most of all, be brokered into some sort of peace, because the death toll, the civilian death toll, is certainly well up into hundreds by now. And while I actually do, it's too premature to say. I think that obviously hostilities have to be at some point. I don't think it's going to be a permanent abatement, but there will be a ceasefire coming up. And again, I expect after the ceasefire, after we hear about the ceasefire, I do expect that it will be breached by another event. Because we know this conflict has a certain fixity to it. It's not going anywhere, as it were. ISIS. A lot of people ask me, what should we do? What should we do? And, I don't really deal so much in what we should do, but mainly on what we're probably most likely to do, based upon the astronomical atmosphere, based upon the horoscope at hand. That's a very interesting perspective on things, because, what we're talking about, what astrology is looking at, is the orbits of the planets. And what are orbits? Orbits are life itself. There wouldn't be any life on Earth at all were it not for the very specific orbit which keeps us at a very specific distance from the sun. We all know that a deviation in our orbits around the sun of just a little bit would end life on Earth. We know that. So orbits are important, and the astrological chart of a nation, of an individual, it shows the relation of the larger orbit of the planets and the universe and the galaxy to the smaller, microscopic quantum orbits deep inside of us, way deeper than the cellular level. Astrology somehow manages to crystallize these ephemeral connections in the form of a very delicate, very robust symbology, an interplay between four symbol systems. And tonight we've tried to apply some of those symbol systems to the more troubling hot spots. Oh, look, I have a message from Steve. He lost internet. He's gonna rant about this, folks. He's got a crusade against the internet. Let's see if we can't get him back here. Poor fella. There he is. Man, that Skype green is really, really great. We're bringing him in now. Maybe I can give my voice a break. I know you guys are tired of hearing it. Hello, Steve.
Hello. I'm sorry, technical problems there, but I'm back. Where were you up to?
Well, I was just lecturing and sermonizing about astrology and how it represented a bridge between the quantum world of our mysterious interior to the
the mysterious world of the universe and the galaxy as a whole, and the interaction, indeed, of galaxies itself. So I was just doing my thing, man.
Well, it's a good point, because people don't realize that we receive the planetary rays. In other words, we know that we're very much affected by the sun in our solar system. So if the sun didn't rise tomorrow morning, there would be no light, and there's no source of energy. And we know as well that we're very much affected by the moon. So the menstrual cycle is governed by the moon, and the moon governs and affects hormonal changes, and liquids like the oceans. So we literally are receiving the planetary rays collectively and individually, and we receive them individually based upon our natal profile. So what were the planetary rays at the time you were born? Did you have a positive and strong connection to Mars, or a weak and discordant connection to Mars? And that determines how you receive ongoing the rays of Mars and of each of the planets. So I think that we're trying to show in our show, we are demonstrating in our show, that we're completely involved with these planets. It was interesting, though, that when I was trying to get my internet up and running, I had to wait a little while for it to kick in, and I saw that there's some breaking news on CNN. So Hillary Clinton is blaming Putin for the downing of MH17, and she made some interesting comments. So she said, "I think if there were any doubt, it should be gone by now that Vladimir Putin, certainly indirectly, bears responsibility for what happened through his support of the insurgents in eastern Ukraine and the supply of advanced weapons, and frankly the presence of Russian special forces and intelligence agents." But she went on actually to say that the Europeans need to stand up against Putin, and they don't seem to be on the sanctions front, because they have a much greater trade involvement with Russia than the United States does. But she made some very interesting observations about her personal interactions with Putin. So she said, he's a very arrogant person to deal with. He's very tough. He's a very arrogant person, which I think is a combination of the vision of Russia and some fundamental insecurity, because when you're dealing with him, he often acts as though he could care less. And she said, there was a G20 summit in Los Cabos, Mexico in 2012, and our president had a meeting scheduled. He kept President Obama waiting 40 minutes before he showed up. He sat down. It was a very small meeting on both sides of the table. We, at the time, were very hopeful that we could get more cooperation from Russia to slow down Bashar al-Assad and what he was doing in Syria. Putin could not have looked more bored, more discomforted, and never apologized for being late. And really interesting observations. She'll also make some very interesting observations about Israel and Palestine, and the fact that Hamas does place missiles and command and control units in civilian areas, but that the casualties are clearly too high in the recent military engagement, or the engagement of Israel's military, let's say. So I think she makes some really interesting observations, and I'm grateful. She must be listening to the show again, because she's made these really pertinent comments just when we were just after we were talking about Putin and Russia's chart against or aside the MH17 chart. So perhaps she thought she would chip in, and I don't think she's got a dial-in number. She's gone to CNN, but it's helpful.
Yeah, I do think it's well timed. Quite frankly, what a terrible diss for Putin to come in late like that. I mean,
yeah,
and
it says a lot about him. It really says a lot about him. Your behavior says a lot.
It says a lot about his opinion of not only our leaders, but also us. So, hey, this conflict between America, the West, and Russia is definitely escalating, unfortunately. And we tend to think of, hey, sure, fine, America's declining, great. We understand that. But we tend to think of it in terms of a power vacuum, to use a cliche. That's the cliche, that's how it goes, a power vacuum. So we think of an empty space where, entrepreneurial, enterprising, ambitious people can rush in to fill. But what's going on here, and this is true to a degree, but what also is happening is that there's a dispersal of power, sort of like an isotope, giving off, radiating electrons. In other words, the dispersal energy. Instead of an empty field waiting to be filled up, there's a huge entity that's there that's slowly radiating, its mass off of itself. Do you see what I'm saying? And so, at Russia and China and some of our other traditional opponents, for lack of a better word, I think what they're thinking of is, hey, we're in the presence of this massive energy field that's represented by the force of America's decay, the heat generated by America's decay. Decay is an extremely fertile process without trying to get too gross about it. I mean, we all can imagine all the sorts of unwanted life forms that sprout up around decomposing organic forms. So, what was I saying before I rudely interrupted myself? Yeah. So,
I think you were applauding Hillary for chipping in.
I was applauding Hillary for chipping into the content of our discussions here, but I think that maybe we could handle the Russians a bit more delicately. Yeah, but what is the antagonistic stance taken by our two countries. As for what we can possibly do or should be doing, as I was saying when you were dealing with internet problems, I don't really know if I could or should even be saying that, or if even that's important, because what we're doing with astrology is looking at what probably will happen, what's most likely to happen, what the background elements or the hidden elements are regarding this or that situation.
Mm-hmm.
That's what.
Well, there has been a ceasefire agreed, 12-hour pause in hostilities in Gaza.
Yeah. See there, so. And that's good news. Let's hope that this sort of abatement and ceasefire will continue. Will it last? I don't anticipate it to. As another thing I was pointing out, looking at the perfected houses in Israel's chart, before I sort of got lost in a maze of chart spore. You know what I'm saying? I had like all these charts open and was trying to find the right one. My cat, I adopted a cat, and, he's trying to crawl up my pants leg right now.
It's great to have kittens around. I almost ended up with 2 kittens last weekend.
Well, I think he adopted me, actually. Well,
let me tell you that, Stephen, some great headlines on RT. There's a reporter for RT by the name of Graham Phillips that's been deported from the Ukraine. There's a report that the NSA was partnering with the Saudi regime. That information was leaked by Snowden. Let's see what else we've got. So the 12-hour ceasefire in Gaza, but I don't feel that it will last. And then the video about ISIS blowing up Prophet Jonas's tomb in Iraq.
Yeah.
Let's see. Google's next data collection project, human body. Moscow refutes Washington's innuendos. Says U.S. shares blame for East Ukraine crisis. Massive rallies in Iran urge Palestinians to fight Israel to the end.
Wow.
And again, you see, I'm very concerned about the middle of August. We've said that before. You were talking about solar returns before, actually. Do you have a solar return for Israel? Because it would be interesting, before we wrap up, to take a quick look at the solar return for Israel to see what that tells us about this year, and particularly August. But before you answer the question, also there's a report here, sanctions against Russia spark AK-47 buying frenzy in the United States.
Oh my God, that's terrible.
Yeah.
I mean, the AK-47 is an ugly thing. I mean, its only purpose is to hurt people. You know what I mean? Hurt things, hurt living things.
Yeah.
I mean, unless you live on a prairie or in a frontier wilderness, where you're vying face with Kodiak bears or whatnot. Even then, but yeah, we were talking some about the solar return chart, Steve, and they do have some interesting information to give about Israel's year. I mean, bearing in mind that the year for Israel starts in May on its birthday and ends in May. So the solar return would be for 20.
So the recent chart then. Do you have the chart or do you want me to run it?
I have the chart. Let's see if I can email it to you, man. I have to get technological here. I have the chart. I mean, you could run it if you wish. If you did it for 2013, 2014, 2015.
Okay, so just run Israel's chart for its birthday, basically.
Exactly, because you know what, guys, and this is great for everybody listening at home, because I'll tell you something. Solar returns are a preeminent predictive and forecasting tool, and man, they can tell you an awful lot. I love solar returns. I'm going to get a T-shirt that says that. I love solar returns. I'm going to get a bumper sticker that says, I break for solar returns. Because, when used in combination with profections especially, they give a lot of information about the individual or the nation's what their motivation is for that year, what they're going to be involved with for that year. Do you see? And so you can use, for example, the perfected ascendant, the perfected house. You can compare that to the solar return. So this is the comparison between these systems that yields.
This is a problematic chart. Have you got this chart there in front of you?
Yeah.
This is a concerning chart that seems to reiterate our concerns for Israel, because firstly there's a grand square,
right,
and Mars is conjunct the ascendant, so Mars is definitely a theme, and then we've got Saturn in Scorpio conjunct the Moon being the common people, Saturn being the major malefic, and those two are in opposition to the Sun. So this is a worrying chart. And again, the ascendant's in Libra, and Venus, the ruler of Libra, is in Aries in opposition to the ascendant. This is not a happy chart at all, is it?
No, it's not, because I'll tell you something. Venus in Aries is in the sign of her detriment. So she's going to represent lust. She's going to represent greed. She's going to represent sadism. And it looks to me like she's in the term here of Mercury, which is very interesting. I'm not quite sure what that might mean. Mercury in this chart is in his sign, Gemini, great, in the 8th house. So Mercury, by being in the 8th house, is determined towards physical mortality, towards death, in other words. And so, that sort of introduces that delineation. Mercury's placement in the 8th house, being in Gemini. So this stretches the period of time covered by this chart, goes from May 2014 right on up to May 2015. And you can actually count around this chart, going from the 1st house to the 2nd to the 3rd, etc., right up to the 12th. And the 1st house is going to represent the birthday. Let's see, what's the birthday again? May 8th?
May 14th.
14th, okay.
Yeah, and the natal chart for Israel is 4 p.m. EEDT.
Right. Now, there's been a raging debate about whether to change the solar return chart to the place where the person is now or whatever. No, I don't really do that. I just run the solar return chart for the place of birth and the place of origin. So, for example, I would do solar return charts for America's chart, not in Washington, D.C., but in Philadelphia, because I use a Sibley chart, and that's where the Declaration of Independence was signed. Now, yes, so sure, Venus in Aries is going to be particularly nasty. She's associated with the 7th house of the enemy.
She's opposed by Mars. She squares Jupiter. She squares Pluto. Right. There's something unfortunate on the horizon.
And it's going to totally block Israel's primary motivation, which is to establish the harmony of Libra, as shown by the ascendant in Libra for that year. Now, the natal Israeli ascendant is in early Scorpio, which also falls in the first house. Let's see. Let me double check the natal placement of Mars again. I know it's 28 Leo. How could I forget that? 28 Leo falls in the 11th house of the solar return chart for 2014. So that tells me that Mars's behavior is going to influence the 11th house matters of diplomatic friends.
Yeah, so you said it was 28 Leo.
Right. Mars's natal placement in the Israeli natal chart.
Okay, so it's engaged with the nodes then.
Yeah.
In this solar return, it's not squaring, but it's engaged with the nodes.
Right.
Is anything at around 28 degrees Cancer?
What in
the natal chart?
28 degrees Cancer, late cardinal signs.
And I'm thinking in the Israeli natal chart.
Well,
I've got it here. I should just answer the question myself, so I'm being lazy.
That's in the Israeli ninth house. It's rather close to the ascendant, but it would have to be within 5 degrees to conjunct it.
But what is significant, Stephen, is actually the other end, the opposite part of the chart, because in the natal chart, Jupiter is at 27 degrees Sagittarius. So when you factor that Jupiter into this solar return chart, then it is, let me see, is it in the bends? 1, 2, no, it's not in the bends, but it's engaged with the nodal axis again. Have you ever actually taken a natal chart and then overlaid the solar return chart on the natal chart?
Oh yes, that's a standard part of my work with solar return charts. What I'm doing when I'm analyzing the solar return, first of all, I'm saying, hey, where's the ascendant degree? Where's the natal ascendant degree? Okay, it's in the first house of the solar return. Fine. Now I want to see where's the degree of the natal ascendant ruler. In this case, that would be Mars at 28 degrees of Leo. Okay, well, where's 28 degrees of Leo in the solar return? Oh, wow, it's in the 11th house. Okay, so this tells me what Israel's going to be about in 2014. It's going to be about 11th house matters, clearing things through the Knesset, relations with allies, and also the currency, their economy. The 11th house is the second from the 10th, and therefore is the money of the king, you see. So also, where's the midheaven? The Israeli midheaven is in early degrees of Leo, so that puts it in the 9th house the 10th house of the solar return. You see, so in this way we can see where all of the natal significators are at in the birth figure.
There are some very uncomfortable signs as well in the charts when we take the Israeli natal chart and then we overlay the solar return chart. Saturn in the solar return chart is conjunct the south node of the Israeli natal charts. That's worrying. And then you've got the south node, the transiting south node in the solar return chart opposing the ascendant, and Mars in the solar return chart, planet of violence, conflict, missiles, conjunct Neptune in the 12th house. There's going to be a surprise attack on Israel.
Yeah, well, it's going to be disconcerting for sure. It's probably bloody here. I'm trying to say, one thing I also like to look at for these charts that's important is the Time Lords. Steve, you know what I'm saying? The Time Lords are very important, the planets that rule over various stretches of your life. You know, a lot of people, they talk about a 7-year cycle. Well, even if they don't know about astrology, they feel that their life is timed on a 7-year cycle. And this represents a Time Lord system, whether they realize it or not. You know, for example, when I was born in the hour of Jupiter. And so in the Time Lord system, then every planetary hour after Jupiter is going to be a Time Lord for a year of my entire life. You see what I mean? So I'm looking in my own solar return charts, I'm looking at the condition of the current Lord of the period, the current hour ruler, who represents, 39 hours after the hour of my birth. That hour ruler is the Time Lord, is one among several Time Lords for my entire year. So I would look at his signification in the solar return as well. It's a really fascinating exercise, Steve. I wish we had more time to delve into these charts using the solar return technique and method. It's definitely a technique we'll get into more in future shows. for sure.
Yeah, and we need to have some shows that are probably specifically instructional for people that want to learn about astrology, because I think that I've had some great feedback about our radio show, and I've had a number of people contacting me saying that they really enjoy it, and actually I was quite surprised. I wasn't sure that they had enough knowledge of metaphysics or of astrology specifically to enjoy the show, but they said that they found it very accessible, which is just great, really, really great.
That's encouraging. I've gotten similar feedback, and it's an important issue to me, man, because I tell you something. It's a huge challenge to render these extremely difficult concepts, sanely, sensibly, simply. It's harder to do than one might realize. And so, I would imagine. Let's pretend that I'm the teacher of a course in astrology, and all of you guys listening at home, all 7 billion of you, are pupils in my class. And let's say we take a test, and you get like a 30 on the test. You feel terrible. You feel awful. I'll never be any good at astrology. Well, you know what I would say to you? The first time I took that same exact test, if I were sitting in your shoes, I would get probably a lower score than you got. You know what I mean? It's not that what's important in this course, quote unquote, isn't so much whether you pass or fail. It's that you're seated. Your mind has been furrowed by the plow of experience and knowledge, and your brain has been seated with a higher understanding of astrology. And it'll click into place as the years progress. And in this way, you'll learn more and you'll progress. And in this way, Stephen and myself will also learn more and progress because, hey, the day will never come where I know everything. God forbid. I'd hate to see that day. It would be a hell of boredom, if you ask me.
Yes, well, because we wouldn't be able to read any more books. I've got some great books that have arrived today for this evening, and I'm working. I've got clients all day tomorrow, but Sunday I'm taking the day off, so I'll be devouring some books. Well, Stephen, before we wrap up, do you mind doing a little promotional piece telling people about our websites and what we have to offer ourselves?
Absolutely. You can find me at thegingerpsychic.com. You can reach me through Stephen at thegingerpsychic.com. Both Stephen Frampton and myself are available for private consultations via Skype, via phone, and we specialize in analytic astrology, hermetic spirituality, and occultism. Additionally, Stephen is a psychic medium. You can find him at StephenFrampton.com, and that's Stephen with a V, y'all. And Frampton is F-R-A-M as in Mary, P as in Paul, T as in Tom, O-N as in Nancy.com. There you can find a link to get a copy of his book, Thinking Completely Outside the Box, which, as I like to say, doubles as not only an expose of the astrologicals behind the Aurora, Colorado theater tragedy with James Egan Holmes, but it also serves as a very adequate primer and introduction into some of the more esoteric angles of astrology, such as declination and matters of latitude from the ecliptic. And he does so in a way that invites beginners. So by all means, do visit him at StephenFrampton.com. Pick up his book. Visit me at thegingerpsychic.com. Check out some of my articles. I got some more coming as we end the summer here. And, every good thing must come to an end. That's the sucky thing about studying cycles, bro. You know what I'm saying? They always cycle to a close. It reminds me of the old wise man who said it's better to be on the hub of the wheel instead of on the rim, so you can reduce the cycling up and down. That's why on the tarot, on the Wheel of Fortune, you have Typhon, at the bottom of the wheel, and Anubis or some other heroic figure at the top of the wheel to signify fate treating us good, So, as always, I appreciate your help on this one, Stephen. We had some thorny topics tonight, bro.
Yes, and next week is going to be interesting as well because it looks like it's going to be a very busy week out there in the world, and there'll be lots to discuss again next week. I did want to say, Stephen, to our listeners that if there are subjects they want us to look at, then please let us know. Just contact us by email or through the Facebook page at Metaphysical Media. And also, Stephen, we are going to get our Metaphysical Media website out there, probably in the fall time before it's fully populated, but also it will outline the consulting services that we offer to businesses and organizations. So we'll be working on that.
Absolutely, and that website will also serve as a hub for educational materials that you can pick up, samplers as well as premium materials for education. So keep that on your agenda. Be on the lookout for that. It will be in development. It's in development now. It'll be live soon. Well, that brings us to the end of another wonderful show. We enjoyed it, everyone, and we'll see you guys next week. Bye, everyone.